In 1987, arcades weren't what they used to be. The golden age was sounding off its last hurrah as the coin-op market quietly slipped off into a slow, inevitable decline. Meanwhile, Nintendo's Famicom had overtaken Japan and revived the American console market as the Nintendo Entertainment System, finally washing away the decaying remnants of Atari and its rivals' foolhardy business tactics, while also standing admirably against the home computer juggernaut of Commodore. With the games industry shifting away from the arcades, veteran developer Capcom elected to get with the times sooner rather than later, and invested its resources into building up a new team of young talent to tackle the challenges of developing a game intended solely for the rising home console market. The result was Mega Man, and the rest, as they say, is history. These days, the original Mega Man gets overshadowed by the improvements made by its sequels, but this shouldn't detract from its strength as an individual title. For our purposes right now, let's focus on the first game as if it existed in a vacuum with no sequels at all. Something cool about the original Mega Man that wasn't so widespread in its day was how it played with the idea of non-linear gameplay. That is to say, it was designed with the intention of allowing the player some freedom in how the game was completed. Mega Man debuted in 1987, following just after the original Legend of Zelda and Metroid games. What's interesting is that all three of these games feature non-linear gameplay, but run with the idea to different extents. The Legend of Zelda resembles an early open-world game with its large environment and relatively hands-off approach to the player's progression. Metroid is more of a semi-open world game, demanding that players perform several linear actions to unlock access to more of the environment. Finally, Mega Man doesn't bother with an explorable world at all. Instead, it offers several linear stages that can be completed in any order the player chooses. Being able to choose what order you play the levels gives Mega Man some unique strengths, but also some hurdles to overcome. On the upside, there's better replay value when the game progresses however the player chooses on a given playthrough. On the downside, balancing the game's difficulty becomes much trickier when the developer is forced to design most of the levels with the idea that the player could access each of them at any given point. Even allowing for this small amount of player agency makes creating a proper learning curve that much harder. If most of the levels are too difficult, new players are driven away. But if most of the levels are too easy, then there's a risk of losing long-term appeal by boring the player. So how did the Mega Man team address this? Well, it looks like they took the first 6 stages of the game and divided them into 3 tiers of difficulty. Cutman, Bombman, and Gutsman are the beginner levels, Fireman is intermediate, and Electman and Iceman are the veteran levels. Or at least that's how it seems to me. Depending on what you personally find difficult, you may or may not relate. The 6 initial levels of Mega Man all challenge the player to varying degrees by demanding mastery of the basic mechanics of play. Mega Man is a platform game and a shooter, so the mechanics revolve around negotiating the environment by leaping over obstacles across gaps and blasting everything that dare oppose you. On the whole, I really like how the developers chose to build their levels around pushing the player to utilize a variety of different tactics that all feel like natural extensions of the basic controls. Mega Man's gameplay rewards quick reflexes and good observational skills. Most things can be handled by a quick hand, but mastery depends on how well the player recalls past lessons and adapts them to new situations. Bombman's level is content to introduce new enemies in fairly safe ways. The player is rarely pushed to compromise between multiple threats, instead having time to learn each individual enemy type for future reference. Mega Man is also equipped with a life bar, which gives the player permission to make mistakes without being punished too harshly, especially with the frequency of healing items dropped by enemies. The level design itself encourages the player to position themselves in such a way as to avoid being harmed long enough to understand how the next obstacle works. This is good design, especially if played as the introductory level, as it lays a solid foundation for the player to learn the basic mechanics of the game, while gaining experience with enemies that will be encountered later on. Bombman is a great boss for this level since he embodies the lessons and their execution perfectly. He's programmed to maintain distance from the player at most times, giving them more time to observe his attack patterns without being under constant pressure. Gutsman's level also plays things very safe, and keeps the challenges centered on positioning and timing. Like Bombman's stage, there's a strong feeling of beginner-friendly permeating this level. Aside from an instant kill drop that the player has no forewarning of towards the end, the whole stage plays nice and patient as the player becomes more accustomed to the mechanics. Even Gutsman himself is fairly patient. He just hops around slowly and prays that you learn to time your jumps and shots properly before the end. Gutsman's stage rounds out the 3 easier levels with another well-rounded stage that plays out a lot like Bombman's, but with more emphasis on dealing with multiple threats at once. There's little danger from the environment, with all of the challenge coming from groups of enemies that attack from multiple directions. There's a light puzzle element, dodging between different enemy attacks while searching for the correct path forward, or how to kill the enemies while taking as little damage as possible. Not unlike Bombman's design, Gutsman embodies his level's ideas by forcing the player to negotiate between him and the pair of scissors he throws around the room like a boomerang. Something I haven't mentioned yet is one of the defining elements of Mega Man's gameplay, which is acquiring new weapons from defeated bosses. The reason for this is, other than making certain bosses much easier to defeat, the weapons don't really shine through until the harder levels of the game, where enemy placement and environmental obstacles become much easier to deal with if you have the proper equipment. Elecman, Fireman, and Iceman's levels all feature situations that can be solved outright by possessing the proper weapons. This reinforces the idea that the developers intended that certain levels be played later rather than sooner. Elecman's stage holds the magnet beam item behind some Gutsman rocks, and is mandatory for completing the game. The flame geysers in Fireman's stage are completely negated by Iceman's power. The little sentry robots in Iceman's block puzzle areas can't even be destroyed by the Buster Cannon and require a weapon to kill. Since these 3 levels seem to assume that the player has probably played 1 or 2 of the easier levels before tackling them, it's not surprising that the difficulty amps up. Iceman's level fouls up the player's movement controls, forcing them to slide around or move sluggishly underwater as enemies plow into them. The block puzzles are occupied by the previously mentioned sentries, which will irritate to no end if allowed to live while trying to understand the puzzle. Finally, there's a truly obnoxious moving platform section that would be hard enough with the cannons, flying penguins, and fickle platform AI, but also suffers from some odd hitboxes that can cause the player to clip through the platforms and die instantly. Iceman himself is an interesting boss, particularly because he attacks quite slowly, but deals huge damage for any mistakes the player makes. Like the block puzzles and moving platforms, the player is tasked with making precise movements while constantly observing a changing battlefield. I like how Iceman plays as a boss, and I especially like a later boss that pushes his design further, but more on that when the time comes. Fireman's stage has a lot of kinetic energy behind its design, and probably the highest emphasis on environmental threats of the original 6. Other than death pits, there's little in the stage that will outright kill the player, but plenty of things that will punish repeatedly if you don't pick up the rhythm of the hazards. The timing in some of these sequences has a window of opportunity no larger than a crack, and that alone raises the challenge factor over the likes of Gutsman, Bombman, or Gutsman stages, which were often quite forgiving. Something I like is how this level combines the different types of enemies to catch the player between 2 different patterns of movement, one independent of the player's action, and the other actively seeking the player, or at least affected by it. It keeps you on your toes and serves the more aggressive fire theme of the level. Fireman himself, despite being the gatekeeper for the harder stages in my opinion, is a simple-minded but relentless blaze that mirrors the challenges of his level, if much more narrowly than previous bosses. If by this point you're sensing a trend with these levels, I'm glad, because the process of teaching the player the mechanics they'll need to deal with for the real game, more on that later, while sending them off with a boss that, for the most part, embodies these lessons in each level like some sort of sadistic review, is an element of Mega Man's design methodology that I really appreciate. The developers struck a balance between challenging and liberating the player's progression by saying, we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone here, but make all of the initial challenges based entirely around the most basic mechanics of our game. That way, we'll know for certain that when the time comes, the player will have a solid grasp of those mechanics. Otherwise, how did they get this far? To end the original 6 levels, we come to the big kahuna himself, Elecman. Those familiar with this game will understand why I put Iceman as the hardest of the initial bosses, and his stage reinforces his placement as the final level the player should tackle. There are elements of all of the previous stages spread throughout this level. The electric beams mirror Fireman's geysers, the disappearing block puzzles return from Iceman's level, the sliding sentries that can only be killed with a weapon come back, unfortunately once again, and so on. At the same time, there's evidence that the level was split in half during development, with an easier path that forgives the player for not having beaten many others, and a more arduous path that assumes you've come here fully prepared. Elecman himself is a terror of aggression that plays wholly unlike any of the previous bosses. You're likely to be atomized within seconds of the battle starting on your initial attempt, and this sets him apart from the stage and boss balance of the others. Electman doesn't reflect his stage in a literal sense, but more of a spiritual one. He's highly aggressive, giving the player little time to get their bearings or even understand what the hell he's doing. It's ultimately a simple but demanding fight for all of its brief glory, and Electman's resistance to the regular Buster Cannon makes it absolutely clear that this was never intended for beginners. You come in with a solid grasp of timing, positioning, and adaptation, or you don't come in at all.